It's May 1944, and after a fairly quiet winter on the Italian front with minimal movement due to pretty heavy snowfall, the Italian front is now once again in motion. The Ontarios have moved through the Gustav Line and are working with British units on the way to Rome. However, one last line of fortifications stands in their way, the Hitler Line. Built off the back of the Gustav Line in an attempt to salvage what was left of their fortifications, the Germans are highly dug in and tenacious as ever, defending a line named after their own Führer. And it is the Ontario's objective, along with their British compatriots, to breach this line at a small town called AQUINO. Little did they know, this battle would turn out to be one of the most pivotal in their history and the source of a battle honor that they alone possess in the Canadian Armed Forces. In the greater context of the advance on Rome, AQUINO is an ideal point of attack because of, namely, the airfield that is located near the town. That airfield could be of value to the Allied forces later on by allowing them to either stage fighter aircraft or by flying in supplies to further their supply chain. Along with the airfield, a railway and a key highway, highway number 6, that ultimately leads to Rome, are located right near AQUINO. And the Ontarios are essentially using highway number 6 and the railway as two guiding paths that will ultimately, in the months ahead, lead to Rome. The Ontarios as a whole are equipped with 61 cruiser tanks, meaning in this case 61 M4A4 Shermans. They are divided into 3 squadrons comprising 19 Shermans each. In the battle itself, A and B squadrons are the 2 main participating squadrons that are fielded up front, while initially C Squadron is going to be held in reserve. Along with their Shermans, the Ontarios have M3A3 Stuarts, which are, if you think of a typical Stuart tank, the turret is removed and they are essentially used as an armored carrier that can be used for reconnaissance and resupply. They also are working closely with the British 392nd Battery of the 98th Field Regiment, who have been a mainstay in their artillery support throughout the Italian campaign, and whose role, as it will turn out, will be pivotal in the battle ahead. The terrain in Italy was not at all very friendly for tanks. This advance, which was uphill, is a similar case of narrow roads, not a lot of movement room on either side, and the Ontarios had to advance, being flanked by a company each of the 5th Battalion, the Buffs Royal East Kent Regiment. So there was not a whole lot of room for movement from side to side. Add on top of that, the weather at this particular day was not at all good, to say the least. In the early hours of the morning between 0200 and the attack start at 0500, the area was thickly shrouded in fog, which one junior officer described as being so thick he could practically reach out and touch it, and he could not even see the next tank in front of him in his own troop. The Ontarios went into this battle not expecting too much opposition. Early reconnaissance had actually reported that the town of AQUINO was relatively clear of German units, so they did not expect it to be tough going. However, in actual fact, the airfield and the town and the surrounding area were well defended by the German 90th Panzer Grenadier Division, which was supported by self-propelled artillery, tank destroyers like Stugs, and most notably Panther terms, which are Panther tank turrets equipped with 75mm high-velocity cannons built into concrete encasements in the ground, making them very low profile and difficult to actually fire at and hit directly. At the same time, those encasements are extremely deadly to Sherman tanks. One direct hit and that Sherman could easily be done. The attack begins early at 0500 hours under a dense fog. A Squadron moves to the north across the railway line to the north of the airport and then swings back west with the intention of preventing a German retreat to the north and to advance on the airport itself. Meanwhile, B Squadron joins up with 2 companies of the 5th Battalion, the Buffs Royal East Kent Regiment, and advances uphill along a road toward the airport. Things start going awry though when B Squadron and the Buffs reach a cemetery along the way, and as it turns out, the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division is extremely well dug in that cemetery. machine gun emplacements, the likes of which might include something like this MG42 here on the extremely well-engineered Lafette gun mount, could easily hold up infantry on their own for hours on end. And with anti-tank guns also included in the mix, it quickly turned disorderly, especially when the commanding officer and the signals section of the buffs took a direct hit in their universal carrier, and all of them were killed at once. And the Ontarios could no longer confidently fire on the enemy without being worried about hitting their British compatriots. Meanwhile, to the north of the airport, things weren't going much better for A Squadron either. By this point, they've discovered that the airport itself is heavily fortified with anti-tank guns, self-propelled guns, and the feared Panther terms. And several tanks from A Squadron have now found themselves marooned in a depression in the ground, which is the only cover that they can actually find from the Panther terms that are constantly sending rounds over their heads to make sure that they do not try and continue their advance forward. They ultimately remain stuck there throughout the day, despite receiving some support from C Squadron, which had been held in reserve and sent some troops up to assist them, and to B Squadron as well in their own difficult situation. But by the end of the day, A Squadron actually has to withdraw with smoke, canister, and artillery fire with support from the 392nd Battery 98th Field Regiment. From first contact at 0700, the battle remains pretty intense throughout the day. B Squadron never gets beyond that cemetery despite the infantry support and the smoke cover, and they have to withdraw. Meanwhile, to the north, A Squadron is marooned in that depression on the airfield all throughout the day, and only approximately 14 hours later, under the cover of darkness, do they really get the full opportunity to withdraw. All throughout this time, of course, the smoke cover from the 392nd Battery remaining pivotal in giving them some form of cover on the relatively open ground. Once the shooting had died down and the Ontarios had the chance to return to harbor and take stock of the situation, they noticed what severe damage they had endured during the battle. Although one casualty alone was fatal, Trooper John T. Phillips of Toronto, several key leading figures in the regiment had been severely wounded, not the least of which included Major Millen and several other troop and squadron leaders. The equipment losses, though, had been especially severe. 13 Shermans had been lost in the battle, which is around 2/3 of a tank squadron's total fighting tank strength. And of the Shermans that came back, not a single one had escaped being hit at least once. Thankfully, though, the Ontarios were not out of action for long. They were able to replenish their lost equipment, and within the next 5 days, they were able to join in with further support from the 11th Infantry Brigade and the 14th Armored Regiment, or the Calgary Regiment, which was in their own armored brigade, and joined together in support of the 38th Irish Brigade, and finally break through Aquino and carry on their advance through the Leary Valley on towards Rome. Now, the battle being especially harrowing as it was, even the highest ranking of personnel were not spared from injury. In this particular grisly case, this helmet belonged to Major Harry Millen, who was actually the commanding officer of A Squadron, and he was leading the charge to the north of the airfield when, at approximately the same moment, he was struck by a piece of shrapnel and shot across the top of the head by a sniper, the round entering through this side here and then exiting out the other side. Now, just from the size of the entry hole alone, a person might think, well, that's certainly a lethal injury, but miraculously, he actually survived. And he then kept the helmet as a memento, and it later made its way into our museum collection. Another incredible example of heroism displayed at the Battle of Aquino was by the driver of the regimental Padre, Major Waldo Smith. His driver was Trooper Cecil Westover, who the soldiers knew as Westy, and despite having barely a cup of tea and not a wink of sleep in 3 nights to sustain himself, he worked tirelessly throughout the battle, driving his Jeep back and forth to the aid station, evacuating wounded crewmen and personnel, and it's estimated that over the course of the battle, he evacuated over 180 soldiers. His actions are actually referred to in the cover of Major Smith's memoir here, What Time the Tempest, and this illustration shows a medical jeep, if you will, that's evacuating some wounded personnel with a brewed-up Sherman in the background. Since the battle, the citizens of Aquino have been conscious of the Ontario's role in the engagement, and they've done a great deal to remember the regiment and the efforts that it made there. And recently, the local administration of Aquino actually presented this City of Aquino medallion to our museum as a token of gratitude and friendship in recognition of the regiment's role in the battle. With the Ontario Regiment having played such a central role in the Battle of Aquino, it felt only fitting that we coined our premier event of the year, AQUINO Tank Weekend. We decided on that name for several main reasons, namely being, apart from the Ontario's main role in it, the fact that we still operate 2 Sherman tanks in our collection, which were iconic of the regiment's use and actually stayed in service until 1972 with the regiment. And at the time of the event's creation in 2014, we were fortunate to still have 3 veterans from the battle itself who were still with us and who sadly have now since passed on.